They didn't know we were there. The June 2015 surgical strikes in Myanmar. Impal, Manipur, the 5th of June 2015. A light breeze scattered the smell of burning flesh that morning as the bodies of 18 army Jawans lay charred and mangled in the remains of the convoy. The soldiers, all from the Dogra regiment, were headed to the base after an operational deployment when the trucks were ambushed at 0830 hours, just over 100 kilometers from Manipur's capital, Impal. The surprise attack had been swift and unforgiving. As the 11 survivors were plugged with morphine drips and helicoptered out of the site soon after, they knew two things for certain: this was one of the most expensive insurgent attacks in the restive Northeast in decades, and that revenge would be a faraway castle. On that second point, though, it would take less than a week for them to be proved more wrong than they had ever been before. As the army choppers with the grievously wounded survivors coursed through the air towards a base hospital in Manipur, in the country's national capital, a team of India's toughest fighting men was making final preparations to depart for the strife-torn Democratic Republic of the Congo. The commandos from the Army's secretive para-SF carried a fearsome reputation, and were looking forward to the UN peacekeeping duties they had been recently assigned in a country where daily brutality had made the Congo War Africa's deadliest in modern times. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Indian commandos would replace the coveted maroon berets of the parachute regiment with the blue headgear that sets UN peacekeepers apart from other soldiers. The UN Organization Stabilization Mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, known by its French acronym MONUSCO, accounts for the Indian Army's largest footprint on foreign soil. A fourth of the over 19,000 peacekeepers serving at MONUSCO, the world's most costly peacekeeping mission with an annual budget of $1.25 billion, come from India. In June 2015, a para-SF team of about 100 men was to join a battalion-strength force of about 500 men that was on its way to North Kivu, a province blessed with a bounty of minerals in its earth, but which now had rivers of blood flowing through it as a result of war. The Indian soldiers were ready for their African assignment. They would be part of an Indian brigade headquartered in North Kivu's capital, Goma, a fighting force controlling an area of 62,400 square kilometers, encompassing a breathtaking landscape dotted with lakes, volcanoes, mountains, savannas and rivers. UN postings are sought after in the army, and units go through rigorous screening before peace missions are assigned to them. There was no question of the men from the elite para-SF unit not making the cut. In fact, they had been hand-picked to tackle the barbarism that had come to define daily life in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Just as they were about to leave from the Palam Air Force Station in Delhi, they got a call from their home base in Jorhat, Assam. In the brevity that defines communication between commandos, the men were informed about the ambush in neighboring Manipur. In 5 minutes, they had the story and fresh orders. The soldiers did get on a plane that day. But it was the C-130J Super Hercules from the Indian Air Force's 77 Veiled Vipers squadron, which carried them at full throttle over 2,350 kilometers to Manipur. Everything had changed. Plans for the Democratic Republic of the Congo had been instantaneously put on hold. The commandos knew what had happened, but would be briefed about the new mission only the next day. The Indian Army had been wounded, and deeply. Death on duty was nothing new, but the audacity of the ambush threw a blanket of unusual, simmering rage not only over the Dogra battalion that had been targeted, but the entire security establishment as well as the government at the center. The army was breathing fire. It soon emerged that insurgents from 3 outfits active in the state were behind the ambush: the Nationalist Socialist Council of Nagaland Kaplang, NSCNK Kangalipak Communist Party and Kangale Ural Kanalup. The Army's Dogra unit had wrapped up its 3-year field tenure in Manipur and was in the process of relocating to a sprawling military station in the country's north when it had been attacked. The insurgents had managed to slip back across the porous border with Myanmar to safe camps in the jungles along the border. Their hasty hit-and-run retreat wasn't surprising. In the past too, insurgents had been lulled into the comfortable routine of mounting attacks and fleeing across the border to safety. What they hadn't accounted for was that the blood spilt on that highway on the 5th of June would take the army on a course of planning it had refrained from trudging on before. A path down which there would be no turning back. Lieutenant Col. Oscar Delta, 35 years old, was at Limekong, the Manipur headquarters of an Army Mountain Division, when news of the highway bloodbath came in. As with the death of any soldier or innocent in his area of responsibility, Lieutenant Col. Delta felt the blood run to his face. He closed his eyes for a moment, collecting his thoughts. 3 words repeated themselves over and over in his mind. 18 soldiers killed. Lieutenant Col. Delta couldn't remember a more savage action by insurgents in his military career, if not his entire memory. As the 2IC of his para-SF unit, Lieutenant Col. Delta was well known to the insurgent groups responsible for the ambush. They knew what he looked like. They were aware of what he was capable of. And they had just drawn blood, terrible amounts of it, in Lieutenant Col. Delta's own backyard. To say it was a big blow doesn't describe it, Lieutenant Col. Delta, now a colonel, remembers. When you lose 18 men like this, you have to figure out how you can hit back and what options you have. My first instinct was to launch an operation immediately with my team, hunt down those responsible and blow the brains out. A part of a commando's conditioning and training is how to keep his emotional responses in check. Emotions can be the enemy of every mission. Successful special operations require execution unclouded by sentiment, the knee-jerk quality of anger or sorrow. Suppressing the urges that welled up inside him after the ambush would be among the hardest things Lieutenant Col. Delta had ever done. In the army for 14 years at the time, he had spent a good part of it chasing and killing insurgents in the hilly jungles of the northeast. Among the many medals pinned to Lieutenant Col. Delta's chest is a Shaurya Chakra awarded to him for exceptional gallantry in action in 2004, over a decade before the Manipur attack. That year, a young soldier under his command was killed in an ambush laid by insurgents. Delta, then a young captain, led a group of crack commandos that hunted down the insurgents and killed 8 of them. We killed 8 of the 11 guys who laid the ambush. We got 'em the same day. The joy was short-lived. We were faster than 'em. Lieutenant Col. Delta remembers the psychological significance of that swift retribution. It was a lesson that stayed with the insurgents for years. Now, a decade later in 2015, Lieutenant Col. Delta was quick to grasp that the Manipur ambush would be a turning point in the conflict spread across the northeast. He also knew that his unit, specializing in jungle warfare, would be enlisted to deliver whatever retribution was deemed necessary. Over the next 36 hours, Lieutenant Col. Delta's squad, with the guidance and blessings of a grimly determined army and government leadership, would chart out a spectacular mission of revenge. Few know the Northeast better than the men of this particular para-SF unit. And nobody fights the way they do. The Northeast has been a hunting ground for the unit for nearly 2 decades. From its Assam headquarters, commando squads are scattered across the region, primed and ready to jump straight into action anywhere they're ordered to. Lieutenant Col. Delta knew he was a marked man. A well-built warrior standing 5 feet 10 inches tall, his reputation had already spread wide. For insurgents, he was the man to take down. Since 2006, the officer had been, and remains, on most wanted lists of the Manipur-based People's Liberation Army and United National Liberation Front. The fact affects neither his peace of mind nor his work. Militancy is all about fear. They have been seeing me for over 10 years. I think they should be afraid of me. I am the one authorized to carry an automatic weapon and walk freely on the streets in the area, not they, he says. But the paratrooper does not keep his family with him. For their own safety, they continue to live at an undisclosed army base where they have been for several years. Their ancestral home in the northeast remains locked even today. When Lieutenant Col. Delta got his battle orders, he didn't need to prepare his men. Even before the Manipur ambush, Lieutenant Col. Delta's unit had been preparing to strike NSCNK camps across the border in Myanmar after suspected Naga rebels ambushed and killed 8 soldiers in the state's Morn district on the 4th of May 2015, exactly a month before the Manipur attack. Had the 5th of June ambush not happened, the army would have gone ahead with the original plan. A team of para-SF commandos would have infiltrated Myanmar on the night of the 5th of June and wiped out an NSCNK camp that had been on their radar for a while. Headed by Myanmar-based insurgent leader SS. Kaplang, the notorious outfit fighting for the creation of Greater Nagaland ended a 14-year-long ceasefire with the Indian government on the 27th of March that year. It was clear that Kaplang did not want peace. After the abrogation of the ceasefire, the insurgent outfit launched a series of attacks against security forces. Retribution was already thick in the air. The punitive strike had been planned at the local level, but the central government wouldn't take ownership. It would have been executed swiftly and quietly, as such strikes mostly are. But these sensitivities, along with the planned punitive strike from Nagaland, went straight out of the window when the Manipur massacre happened on the 5th of June 2015. We were told that the army chief was flying to Impel on the 5th of June. Something bigger was unfolding, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. Something bigger and deeply more audacious was indeed being planned. The government at the center was absolutely certain that the Manipur massacre deserved immediate punitive action. But what precisely that action would be was yet to be determined. There were already early signs that retaliation was being planned and it would be severe. Hectic developments followed. In Delhi, National Security Advisor Ajit Doval dropped out of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's tour of Bangladesh. Gen. Dalbir Singh, then Army Chief, postponed a visit to the UK. None of this was normal. A day after the ambush, Gen. Dalbir Singh flew to Impel where he was briefed on the developments by Lieutenant Gen. Bipin Rawat, who became Army Chief the following year, then commanding the Army's Nagaland headquartered 3 Corps. Lieutenant Col. Delta and the involved para-SF unit CO were among the select group of men present at the briefing, where Lieutenant Gen. Rawat made it clear that the Manipur attackers were not beyond the Army's reach. Every man in that room knew that the attackers were now on foreign soil. The message couldn't have been clearer. In the warm yellow glow of halogen lamps, the locations of insurgent camps were red-pinned on the maps showing the border areas spanning Manipur, Nagaland and Myanmar. We were told by Gen. Dalbir Singh that the operation had been approved at the highest levels of the government, and the defense minister would be controlling it. Full support. Full backing. This was the moment we had been waiting for, Lieutenant Col. Delta says. While most aspects of the plan remained fluid, one thing was clear by the end of that top-secret briefing: the Army would have its revenge within 72 hours. The decks had been cleared for a daring cross-border raid into Myanmar, surgical strikes that the government in Delhi would not deny. The 7th of June would be D-Day. The senior generals asked Lieutenant Col. Delta to stay back in the briefing room. The broad contours of the surgical strikes on insurgent camps emerged for the first time. The commandos from the lethal para-SF unit would mount a two-pronged attack. From Manipur and Nagaland, 2 teams would simultaneously infiltrate and destroy the jungle sanctuaries that were known to harbor and train insurgents. The orders were grim but clear. Lieutenant Col. Delta and his squads were to hit camps with the largest numbers of insurgents, so the commandos could inflict maximum damage. The targets had to be chosen carefully before launching the mission. It would have served no purpose if the men found themselves at the doorstep of a thinly held camp. The stakes were enormously high, and it wasn't just the government expecting results. A grieving, but steadfast army was too. We spent our first few hours selecting camps which the insurgents would have thought were beyond our reach, where they felt secure. It was not to be a token assault, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. Conventional military maneuvers require a great deal of intricate planning. Special operations on foreign soil are something else entirely. They require a degree of preparation and detail that would make regular drills seem like child's play. Success of special missions depends on a range of factors, chiefly sound strategizing, accurate intelligence and scrupulous planning that takes every eventuality into account. There was no shortage of targets to choose from across the border in Myanmar. Insurgents had found security in the border jungles. Hours after the Manipur attack, the army had zeroed in on the targets that its highly skilled commandos would attack in Myanmar, 3 insurgent camps, which Lieutenant Col. Delta and his men would target. A similar squad would mount an assault from Nagaland. But there was a problem. And it wasn't a minor one. Distance. The camps across the Manipur border were located deep inside, and striking them on the 7th of June, just 2 days later, was a daunting prospect. D-Day would have to be rescheduled. And that, Lieutenant Col. Delta knew, was the only way to increase the chances of a successful strike. He spoke his mind to the generals that evening. There was still much work to be done. The distance was too much. We needed more time. The attack could have been launched on the 7th of June from Nagaland as everything was in place, but the idea was to launch the teams simultaneously. And we couldn't have done it from Manipur in that time frame, Lieutenant Col. Delta remembers. His assessment was as clinical as it could have been. Distance wasn't the only hurdle. The para-SF strength in Manipur wasn't enough to mount the operation. Lieutenant Col. Delta had just 40 men on the 5th of June. And that was why the detachment of 100 para-SF men on their way to the Democratic Republic of the Congo was stopped and diverted to their neck of the woods. They were in Impel by dinner time. Corps Commander Lieutenant Gen. Rawat had shifted base from his headquarters in Nagaland's Dimapur to Impel to manage the new mission. As a brigadier, Lieutenant Gen. Rawat had helmed the Indian Brigade in the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2008-09, and the UN had credited him with defending a key Congolese province that could have been overrun by rebels. Lieutenant Gen. Babacar Gaye, then the force commander of the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, wrote in a commendation later awarded to then Brig. Now Gen. Rawat that it was due to his leadership, courage and experience, that North Kivu's capital Goma never fell. Stability returned to the country's eastern region and the main rebel group was forced to come to the negotiating table. The presence of a hands-on commander, known for his military acumen, helped the commandos prepare literally to defy death on the mission into Myanmar. They knew they were in able hands. The top bosses were in the loop, and arranging a special aircraft to fly the Congo-bound men to Impel happened without a hitch. Lieutenant Gen. Rawat made sure all logistics were taken care of so that we commandos could focus solely on the mission, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. The timely arrival of the commandos was critical for the mission. The 3 insurgent camps were built next to each other. Intelligence inputs pegged the number of insurgents present at these camps at more than 120. Planning the mission with 40 commandos would have been possible, but a grave risk. It would have also limited Lieutenant Col. Delta's options to choose the best men for the mission. For this mission demanded the best of the best. By midnight on the 5th of June, the raid schedule had been reworked and defined. Striking the targets on the 7th of June was officially ruled out. D-Day was now pushed 2 days further to the 9th of June, giving the commandos sufficient time to physically reach the targets. Lieutenant Col. Delta relaxed for the first time that day, exhaling as the men returned to the barracks for a few hours of sleep. The plan had been discussed in as much detail as possible. Lieutenant Col. Delta had told his men that their objective would be to reach a wooded hilltop overlooking the targets by midnight on the 8th of June. The plan was to mount the final assault at the crack of dawn on the 9th of June. It sounded simple enough in theory, but no man listening to Lieutenant Col. Delta breathed any easier. They were looking forward to a tough new assignment on foreign soil. They had spent years training hard in the jungles of Mizoram and elsewhere for precisely this kind of mission. Lieutenant Col. Delta watched them as they retreated to rest. They were ready to prove to the country what India's special forces were capable of. Alone in the briefing room now, Lieutenant Col. Delta stared hard at the map. A passion nurtured over the years, the officer adored maps of every kind, displaying an incredible ability to memorize locations and compute distances at terrific speed. His knack for understanding geography from a piece of paper had always been incredibly valuable to his squad. He switched off the light and walked back to his quarters, aware that this was possibly his final full night of sleep before they set off to exact revenge. The para-SF warriors were to reach a predetermined staging area on the border from where they would move into Myanmar. The movement of the commando team had to be kept as discreet as possible. There was no scope for the insurgents to get the slightest whiff that something was afoot. It would spell the mission's doom. Not only would revenge remain elusive, but more Army lives could be lost. We put our heads together and worked out a deception plan, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. The commandos would be transported in Army trucks to make it look like regular infantry troops being moved, a routine affair in the Northeast. Helicopters were out of the question, they would draw attention. Airlifting the commandos was therefore ruled out. Every detail was a closely guarded secret. Other than the commanders involved in the planning, not a soul knew about D-Day, the mode of transport or the composition of the two teams in Manipur and Nagaland. After a series of early morning briefings and presentations on the 6th of June, the commandos set out. The men were very heavily armed. They were taking no chances. 64 of them hand-picked for the job were carrying Carl Gustaf 84mm rocket launchers, Kulmayo Kalashnikov general-purpose machine guns, Israeli-built Tavor TAR-21 assault rifles, Colt M4 carbines, AK-47s and under-barrel grenade launchers. Lieutenant Col. Delta was carrying his M4A1, the assault firearm he preferred. A smaller, fully automatic version of the venerable M16 assault rifle. The M4A1 carbine is finely tuned for use in special operations. Light and packing lethal power at both close and medium ranges, it remains the weapon of choice in elite squads around the world. Used across the U.S. military as a primary infantry weapon, Lieutenant Col. Delta finds it perfect for quick reaction assault missions. The assault team's arsenal also included Israeli Uzi silenced submachine guns to take down sentries at the camp, and Galil 7.62mm sniper rifles. SF battalions are usually the best equipped units of the Army. And it showed that day. They were carrying enough weapons and ammunition to cause a great deal of damage. The rifles weren't slung across their shoulders. Commandos try not to use slings. A weapon sitting in your hands reduces reaction time. In a firefight, that could be everything. Apart from the weapons, the men were carrying backpacks stuffed with extra ammunition, combat rations, medical kits and water. The soldiers were not traveling light. Each of them was carrying a personal load of 40 kilograms, excluding the weight of weapons. Carrying their heavy loads, the men strode towards the Army trucks that were waiting with their engines on to transport them closer to the Myanmar border. Just as they were about to clamber into the vehicles, Lieutenant Col. Delta handed over his M4 to one of the men, who immediately realized what Lieutenant Col. Delta was about to do. The officer knelt down and kissed the earth, a ritual he followed before every mission, an invocation to the soil as a friend and guide. The Army trucks dropped off the battle-ready team at the staging area at around 0300 hours on the 7th of June. The targets were across the border and still very far away. The men would have to cover a distance of more than 40 kilometers on foot to reach a designated hilltop, from where they could scan the camps before beginning the actual attack. Lieutenant Col. Delta had more than proven his worth as a soldier, but the next 48 hours would test his skills and leadership as a commander. On his shoulders rested the fate of the mission, the lives of the young men under his command and, above all, that intangible element that colors everything that soldiers account for in their line of work, national prestige. At daybreak on the 7th of June, the commandos began the trek through hilly terrain towards the border, with Lieutenant Col. Delta setting the pace and ensuring there was no slowdown. He remembers thinking of nothing else. Only very occasionally would he allow his mind to go to his mother, who had been battling cervical cancer and was to undergo surgery 2 days later at a hospital near his hometown. Nobody in Lieutenant Col. Delta's chain of command knew this. It had not even crossed his mind to ask for leave to be with his family. The mission was literally the only thing that occupied his thoughts. It was nearly dark when the para-SF team reached the border. The temperature had dropped to about 25 degrees Celsius and the men were greeted by a refreshing breeze coming from Myanmar. In 36 hours, this mission would be over. Everything was on schedule. After spending the night on the Indian side of the border, the men crossed into Myanmar at first light on the 8th of June. There was no turning back now. On foreign soil, Lieutenant Col. Delta and his men trekked through 6 kilometers of hill and jungle. The men had done their homework. As part of the detailed planning that went into the operation, the team had hired 2 guides from an Indian border village in Manipur. The guides spoke Burmese fluently and knew their way through every bend in the thick woods that greeted the commandos. The guides' knowledge of the land, coupled with Lieutenant Col. Delta's photographic map-like memory, kept the squad precisely on course. Prepared for anything, the commandos had not encountered a hurdle so far. But they soon would. Not long after the men had crossed a rivulet that demarcates the border between India and Myanmar, they stopped in the tracks. The route they were taking through the wilderness was supposed to be isolated, bereft of human settlements. Apparently not. A group of men walked right into the squad, hauling a bounty of monitor lizards from among the 5 species found in the area. At being questioned by the guides, it turned out that the men were Burmese hunters who had killed the large lizards, considered a delicacy and aphrodisiac in some parts of the world. There were 5 of them. We weren't expecting them, but there they were, and something had to be done, Lieutenant Col. Delta remembers. The easiest option was to leave them alone and move on. But Lieutenant Col. Delta didn't want to leave anything to chance. Loose ends are frequently what cause the demise of precisely planned operations. There was always the possibility that the men were informants sent by the insurgents as eyes and ears. It would take one word of warning from them to destroy the entire mission. The other option was to kill them. But Lieutenant Col. Delta knew he and his men couldn't ever bring themselves to do that, not without proof that they were helping insurgents. They could well have been hunters who were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Or maybe it was us. We were on the turf, Lieutenant Col. Delta smiles. Lieutenant Col. Delta made his decision. He ordered his men to secure the hunters with the ropes they were carrying, and decided to take them along as captives right up to the point from where reconnaissance teams could survey the camps. They simply could not risk the mission. Lieutenant Col. Delta glanced at his mountain hardware watch, which had replaced his Fitbit activity tracker band that was his usual wristwear when not on duty. The men hadn't lost time. He told them they would make a brief halt soon for a quick meal. The team hadn't slowed down for a moment, moving briskly as they neared the targets. The tune playing in their heads could well have been a memorable military song from the film Lakshya. Lieutenant Col. Delta had played it on the sound system in the barracks the night before they left Impel. Kandhon Shay Miltain Kandhi, Kadman Shay Kadam Miltain Hum Chaltain Jab A's To Dil Dushman Ki Hiltain. When we walk shoulder to shoulder, and march in step as brothers, when we move like this, our enemies tremble in fear. Like most army men, the commandos loved the song and knew the lyrics by heart. By noon on the 8th of June, the steep hill they were headed towards loomed into view. From its flattened crest, the commandos would get the first view of the camps they would obliterate the next day. It was time for a much-needed hot meal. The commandos' backpacks held hexamine fuel tablets along with cooking stoves. A quick lunch was rustled up using the smokeless, odorless, long-burning tablets. The meals, ready-to-eat packs, contained rajma pulao. The famished men ate in turns. A cordon of soldiers made sure they were well guarded at all times. For dessert, they helped themselves to shakapara from a common polythene bag, a sweet that reminded them of celebrations back home. Marching into thicker foliage at the base of the steep hill, their fatigues ensured the commandos blended in well. By the time the team began climbing up the hill, they realized they had almost run out of water. Each man had carried 7 liters in his backpack. It was the peak of summer and the men were parched. It wasn't something they were not trained for, but neither was it a favorable situation the day before a big assault. The sooner they finished their mission, the faster they could get water from the destroyed camps, Lieutenant Col. Delta joked too. Quiet laughter and cheers. He glanced at the men in his squad. Every one of them was under his charge. He was responsible. The mission had primacy in the men's minds, but Lieutenant Col. Delta knew that it was his responsibility to make sure no one got hit. Or worse. In a fast-paced situation, anything could happen. A casualty evacuation scenario would not only be a nightmare logistically, but also leave fewer men available for the mission. It was something the squad simply could not afford. Apart from the big picture, there was also something that only those in fighting units could fully comprehend. We knew if something went wrong, the battalion's honor would be sullied. people would say SF stands for Sabse Faltu, most useless. How could we let that happen? Never, says Lieutenant Col. Delta. As leader of the mission, Lieutenant Col. Delta was in touch with the army leadership in Impel. He was carrying a mobile phone and the signal strength was at 3 bars. It was known to the army that Indian mobile phones continue to function up to a certain distance along the border. Missed calls based on a predetermined code were used to stay in touch during the operation. Through a combination of missed calls and communications over a secure satellite link, Lieutenant Col. Delta remained connected with the army leadership. Fully backing the army's mission, the government in Delhi had kept its counterpart in Nay Tav, Myanmar's capital, in the loop. For security reasons, Lieutenant Col. Delta cannot reveal the other modes of communication he maintained during the mission. The team would regularly receive intelligence updates. Some inputs suggested the insurgents might have fled the camps. Delta, are you sure the guys are still there? Can you see them? There's a possibility that the situation may have changed, said a voice at the other end of the line during one such transmission. Lieutenant Col. Delta had been prowling the northeast for over a decade and had built an excellent network of informants. There was no doubt in his mind that the insurgents were at the camps, and in large numbers. He calmly told the caller not to worry. He and his men hadn't come all the way to raid empty camps. As the commandos began climbing the steep hill, those carrying TAR-21 assault rifles took the slings out. The Israeli weapon is built but heavy and muzzle light, the magazine and firing mechanism are located behind the weapon's trigger. SF guys don't use slings. We believe in carrying our weapon in our hands to react swiftly. But you can't climb a steep hill holding a Tavor due to its design, Lieutenant Col. Delta explains. A few hours later, as the sun set, the para-SF squad arrived at the hilltop. Lieutenant Col. Delta and his men took carefully picked positions from where the targets were now in sight. The men felt the first big rush of combat adrenaline. The camps were barely 400 meters away. The reconnaissance elements from the team were at the highest positions to observe the camps, their layout and possible movement of insurgents within. The rest of the men had occupied positions below them. Every man on that hilltop had night vision gear. The camps they now gazed at belonged to the Manipur-based People's Liberation Army, but were used extensively by NSCNK cadres. As moonlight bathed the hilltop that June night, Lieutenant Col. Delta rehearsed and fine-tuned the final plan for the pre-dawn assault. With his team leaders, he went over how the teams would be divided 4 ways. The first subunit would storm the camp in an initial direct assault. 2 cut-off subunits would take down insurgents trying to escape. And a 4th team would form the crucial rearguard group. The orders were clear. The assault would begin with devastating firepower before sunrise the next day, the 9th of June. At the same time, the corresponding para-SF squad 100 kilometers away in Nagaland would begin its own assault on an NSCNK camp that was believed to be sheltering the insurgent group's notorious military advisor, Nikki Sumi. Just as the final assault plan was firmed up, the silence on the hilltop was shattered by a burst of automatic fire at around 2100 hours. The commandos sat up in their positions, their weapons ready. Had the cover been blown? Lieutenant Col. Delta hoped it hadn't. Had the insurgents discovered the commandos' arrival? Had they anticipated their route? I thought the whole plan had gone to hell. I thought it was finished, Lieutenant Col. Delta remembers. He took a deep breath and in whispers ordered his men to remain statue still in their positions. Not a sound could be heard but a mild breeze through the trees. If the men had been detected, Lieutenant Col. Delta would have had to make an immediate decision. The mission would have been turned on its head from being primarily a surprise assault to a totally defensive, evasive escape mission. It would no longer be about prestige and retribution but about survival. It was clear now that the insurgents had begun sending out patrols to secure the perimeter of the camps. They had ventured uphill, coming as close as 150 meters to the positions held by the commandos on the hilltop. The patrollers were singing at the top of their voices and flashing the torches. The cheer, probably drunken, was a sign the patrolling was routine and that they likely did not have a clue about death crouching on a hilltop above them. They fired some shots in the air. It turned out to be speculative firing to provoke a reaction and confirm if someone was in the darkness in the woods around. They didn't know we were there, Lieutenant Col. Delta says. A wave of quiet relief swept over the soldiers. Their plan was intact. Some of the men had puris and chutney for dinner as they prepared to go without sleep for the third night straight. But even if the commandos had wanted to get a few hours of shut-eye, midnight brought a fresh surprise. Just after midnight, a group of insurgents from the camp began firing in the air. The same worrying question about being robbed of the element of surprise exploded once again in Lieutenant Col. Delta's mind. A voice inside his head told him that Plan B was very likely going to be necessary. He didn't need to communicate this to the commandos. The men lay silent and motionless, rooted to their positions. Every last one of them expected a full firefight to break out at any moment. The firing continued for 10 minutes. And then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The insurgents walked sleepily back into the camps, only to emerge again 3 hours later for another round of firing. It was 0300 hours. This was proving to be confounding and frustrating. Had the insurgents really been tipped off about the stealthy advance of the para-SF team? It became evident to Lieutenant Col. Delta by this time that the assault plan would have to be considerably altered. As things stood, the squad's solitary reconnaissance team was still perched on the hilltop, while the rest of the squad held positions on the slope below. A commando officer on the team crawled from his position to where Lieutenant Col. Delta was. Then leaning in, he whispered that if the men could take their final assault positions on the hilltop without getting into a firefight with the insurgents, they should go ahead with the attack as planned, come what may. The mission commander had only 2 hours to decide. The conclusion we came to was that if we occupied our final assault positions without loss of surprise, then we would go ahead with a modified plan, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. The modifications were significant. Instead of splitting the team into 4 subgroups, the mission commander now decided on 3. 2 teams would carry out the direct assault, while the third would cover the rear to prevent the commandos from being encircled by insurgents. The third team's crucial task was to ensure safe exit for the 2 assault teams. The plan to send 2 cut-off parties to the other side of the camp was dropped in the changed circumstances. By 0400 hours, the commandos were able to crouch and crawl to their final assault positions on the hilltop without giving themselves away. Lieutenant Col. Delta looked through his night vision glasses directly at the camps down the hill. The insurgents had not returned to their enclosures after the last round of firing an hour before. They were still around. They were not too far from us. We could have caught up with them in about 10 minutes. They were walking towards the camp, says Lieutenant Col. Delta. The commandos had reached the most critical phase of their operation. They started moving cautiously in the direction of the targets. Lieutenant Col. Delta took a deep breath and told his assault teams that they would tail the insurgents right up to the perimeter of the first camp. The strategy worked perfectly. The insurgents had entered the camp oblivious to the sudden creeping presence of 40 heavily armed Indian commandos who had formed a semicircle around the site. The men were positioned so that each one of them could directly fire at the targets. The other 24 commandos stayed behind, keeping a close watch through the techno-glow of their night vision goggles, ready to jump in if they were needed. Inside the camp, the insurgents were apparently preparing their first meal of the day, clueless that it would be their last. The guard was at its lowest. These guys have 2 meals a day, at 0500 and 1500 hours. The attack was timed with the first meal. We knew they would all assemble in the dining area and would be the most vulnerable at that time, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. The attack squad made a final assessment of the target. The first sentry post was empty. There were 2 posts behind it, one manned by 4 insurgents and the other by 2. With a sweep of his hand, Lieutenant Col. Delta quietly ordered the commandos equipped with Carl Gustavs to unleash the first rockets at the 2 sentry posts, blowing them to pieces in a wave of flame. There was nothing left of the 6 insurgents on guard duty. The rocket explosions made the ground shudder. It was only then that the insurgents inside the camp realized they were being attacked. But they also knew they had nowhere to run or hide. The commandos then opened fire on the camp with their assault weapons. A single shot followed by a double tap, repeating the sequence till they emptied their magazines. The men would quickly slap in new magazines and continue raining rounds on the insurgents. The commandos had not put the selector switch on their weapons to full auto mode for burst fire. The problem with bursts is that the bullets spread. Single shot and double tap is far more accurate and you also conserve ammunition, says Lieutenant Col. Delta. Double tap is a technique where 2 shots are fired at the same target in quick succession. The insurgents scattered, baffled and unable to understand what had hit them. The first camp was cleared without much effort. Dazed by the strength of the assault, the insurgents could not respond for the first 25 minutes. When the men were in the process of clearing the second camp, the insurgents started returning fire with automatic weapons. The layout of the camp had sprung a fresh surprise. The commandos had been under the impression that the camps didn't have bunkers. Not true. The insurgents had built army-style deep-dug bunkers inside the camps from where they were now firing at the commandos. The firefight had been on for about 20 minutes when the entrenched insurgents from the third camp began engaging the commandos in the rearguard, sending a deadly fusillade of bullets whizzing over their heads. The well-prepared commandos answered with overwhelming firepower. They opened up their automatic weapons and pumped grenades from their under-barrel grenade launchers, UBGLs, sending shrapnel skying through the air. The men also fired 2 rockets in airburst mode to cause maximum destruction over a wider area. As the earth burnt, it was time for another decision. The mission commander realized that the assault teams had achieved their objective with 2 camps completely destroyed. It was time to pull back. When the rear party got caught in a firefight, I decided that it was time to move out ASAP. The assault teams also attacked the third camp with heavy weapons before leaving, but we did not enter it, Lieutenant Col. Delta recalls. On the ground, there was no time for arithmetic. It would emerge later that the insurgents had taken a huge beating. During that 45-minute assault, the commandos had expended almost 15,000 rounds, more than 150 grenades and a dozen rockets. The men had clear instructions not to stay back to conduct a headcount, but to return as quickly as possible after the mission was complete. They followed those orders. Miraculously, not a single man on Lieutenant Col. Delta's team was hurt. Not even a scratch. The exfiltration route had already been planned. As the commandos pushed closer towards the Indian border, Lieutenant Col. Delta made the call that the army had been waiting for. The magic words were spoken, mission accomplished. In the operations room at Limakong, Lieutenant Gen. Rawat smiled broadly. Everyone in the room cheered. The message was immediately relayed up the chain of command. In the hours that followed, in a rare move that stunned the world, New Delhi would officially reveal India's military response to the Manipur ambush. Lieutenant Col. Delta and his men returned to Manipur around noon on the 9th of June, trudging through forest for the next few hours before arriving at the first border village on the Indian side. It was 1,500 hours. The sun was scorching and the men were exhausted, hungry and dehydrated, but smiling grimly in the glory of their mission's success. From a local store, Lieutenant Col. Delta and the men purchased bottles of ice-cold beer, treating themselves to hungry gulps of the beverage. Lieutenant Col. Delta noticed, as he drank, that the beer was from Myanmar. The men allowed themselves the first laugh in days. Later that day, 2 Army Aviation Corps Dove helicopters clattered into a clearing near the village. They had taken off from Limakong an hour before to fly the victorious commandos back to base. On foot for days, the commandos were delighted that they didn't have to trek the 30 kilometers more to the staging area where they had been dropped off for the mission. By the next morning, all 64 men on Lieutenant Col. Delta's team were back in Limakong. The commando team assigned to target the NSCNK camp across the border from Nagaland was not as lucky as Lieutenant Col. Delta's combat group. The insurgents there had fled hours before the raid. The men simply set the camp ablaze and returned. 15 minutes after landing in Limakong, Lieutenant Col. Delta's phone rang. He was not expecting to hear from the man at the other end of the line. It was Defense Minister Manohar Parrikar. I hadn't even untied my shoelaces when the Raksha Mantri, defense minister, called to congratulate me and the team. It was exhilarating and absolutely incredible. It's not every day that you get a call from the defense minister, Lieutenant Col. Delta, who went on to command a battalion in Manipur, recalls. His work wasn't over, however. Lieutenant Col. Delta spent the day debriefing the army leadership about the mission. He spared no detail. It missed nobody up the chain of command and government that history had just been made by the men of the Para-SF. When he was finished, Lieutenant Col. Delta allowed himself the liberty of remembering his family. He wanted to drive to the hospital to meet his mother, who had been operated upon that morning. Lieutenant Gen. Rawat and the other commanders were astonished to learn of Lieutenant Col. Delta's mother's cancer surgery just a few hours before. The commanders were not comfortable with Lieutenant Col. Delta's plan to drive down to the hospital alone in his Maruti 800. They knew hit squads would be after him. But Lieutenant Col. Delta politely refused a commando team for his personal protection. He spent 4 hours with his mother and returned to the base the next morning. In Delhi that day, the army would tell a packed news conference that the commandos had raided the insurgent camps on the basis of credible and specific intelligence, and inflicted significant casualties on the insurgents. The army gave no specific numbers, but estimates that emerged later pegged the figure in the range of 40 to 50. The Burmese army is believed to have transported the bodies in 2 trucks to a nearby location for quick burial. Scores of badly wounded men were taken for treatment to a hospital south of where the commandos struck. The casualty figure would have been far higher had the cut-off teams been able to deploy on the other side of the camps as well. 2 months after the strikes, on the eve of Independence Day, the government announced a Kirti Chakra for Lieutenant Col. Oscar Delta, a Shaurya Chakra for a Havildar-ranked commando on his squad, and Senar medals, gallantry, for 5 other commandos who were involved in the cross-border raid into Myanmar. The strikes made Lieutenant Col. Delta a cult figure in a regiment already full of heroes. But you'd never know it if you met him. You are not a Rambo out there. My Kirti Chakra, India's 2nd highest peacetime gallantry award, belongs to every man who took part in that mission. We did our job and it's a fantastic feeling being recognized for it. But other than that, awards really do not matter, says Lieutenant Col. Delta. The officer does have one regret regarding the mission, though, not having brought back a flag or any other object from the camps as a war trophy. Before heading out for the mission, Lieutenant Col. Delta had requested the army leadership not to fix a deadline for exfiltration, as the commandos were planning to return with a captured flag. Unfortunately, there was no opportunity for us to seize a flag. I guess we will have to wait for another mission, he says, smiling. But what happened to the Burmese hunters the commando squad had taken captive? Lieutenant Col. Delta instructed his men to set them free minutes before the commandos began their descent from the hill for the final assault. They were given 5,000 rupees each to compensate them for the trouble. In appreciation, before they melted into the woods, the hunters offered the commandos some monitor lizard meat. Lieutenant Col. Delta remembers the flavor, and the meat was just the way he liked it. Raw. Note, some names in this chapter have been changed to protect the identity of Special Forces officers who operate in hostile territory.